This would probably be advice for the brokers out there is if you're thinking about sourcing drugs internationally, start asking about the rebate impact it has. And what's the rebate on that Skyrizi drug? Does it make sense, to Trevor's point, on a net cost basis to actually move that over? You'd be surprised. There's vendors out there that are sourcing drugs internationally. It's costing the plan more money because maybe it's a brand that could be a generic, or maybe on a net cost basis, it's actually costing the plan more.
Welcome to Claim Talk. I'm your host, Danielle Young. This is part 2 of a 2-part series about pharmacy. And if you did not listen to the first one, you have to go back and listen to that one because I'm not going to make these guys introduce themselves again. So we're going to go ahead and jump right in to our next topic, which I wanted to talk about: international drug sourcing. Does someone want to take a stab at kind of defining what international drug sourcing is again for Mike Kroupa's future son who's going to be a broker? If you don't get the joke, you have to listen to the first one.
Mm-hmm. Well, international sourcing is a complex topic, not surprising, because now we're dealing with situations where and it isn't where other countries are coming to us for our drugs. We're actually pursuing the purchase of medications in other industrialized countries. And so this has kind of evolved over a number of decades, and part of the challenge that we have with this is, one, and we can talk about this, but technically speaking, it's illegal to purchase drugs outside the United States because they're not FDA-approved products. And so that in and of itself has created a lot of controversy, as you might imagine. But the other side of the coin is a lot of people that are struggling with the cost of medication, and employers have recognized that acquiring drugs outside the United States in other countries, in some cases, can be significantly less expensive than purchasing within the United States. So money is driving a lot of the decision making there, more so than anything, I would say. Now, this is complex. There's a lot to that. I don't know if you want to add any more to the definition or anything else to clarify.
No, I think you make a great point of the competing regulatory authorities that don't necessarily add up, right? So you've got law that says it's illegal. You've got health plans governed by ERISA that have a fiduciary responsibility. You've got, Section 125 considerations. So you've got all these competing regulatory situations that make international sourcing very complex. But I think in the most simple form, right, it's targeting high cost, typically brand and specialty drugs, and getting them from another tier 1 country instead of getting them in the United States. And we've already talked in episode 1 about, some of the issues with the United States pharmaceutical system. There's a fair amount of other countries that don't have those same issues. So it can be a tool in the toolbox, but it's also not a silver bullet.
Yeah, and you can source a lot of drugs internationally: generic drugs, brand drugs, specialty drugs. I agree with Trevor on let's target certain drugs for this, right? Like if you're thinking about the last episode where we talked about a fiduciary and you got a Skyrizi that costs $21,000 on a carrier insurance plan, but it costs $7,500 internationally. What's in the best interest of the beneficiary there, right? I think it would be to get that for $7,500 and make it free for them,
Yeah.
As long as quality, right? And that's where, is it the same manufacturer? Is it, has it been through the same testing? And if you're using the right partners, then it is, right?
Yeah.
And I think that's where a lot of people get nervous about international.
Yeah, I think there's this broad assumption that if you're sourcing drugs internationally, they're coming from anywhere, right? It's no, that's not the case. They're coming from countries that have an FDA in place. There's standards, and a lot of them come, just upstairs from Canada. So
Yeah, I was going to go back to that. I wanted us to speak to a second to the FDA, because in my past I've run into situations where it was interesting. Someone said, "Well, we'll get that drug to the front door of your patient, and all of the labeling will be in English. It'll be okay." And I'm like, why does it matter well, obviously because the patient needs to be able to read it, but it's because they wanted the patient to feel like it came from America, because we see the FDA as the gold standard. So I kind of wanted to circle back and talk about perhaps other countries' FDA equivalents and draw some conclusions around the safety of drugs that come from other places.
Well, and a lot of times, what we're really talking about is the same manufacturer that's producing the drugs in the United States for the United States with FDA approval, but that same manufacturer has also pursued approval from the various countries and their FDA equivalents. So whatever country they seek to get approval in, they have to go through their standard regulatory process. And so that's why it's important to not only look at which drug, who the manufacturer is, but what authority or regulatory agency ensured appropriate utilization within that country. But there's other pieces to this too. Just as a pharmacist, I think about, okay, not only that piece of it, but what's the shipping look like? So in other words, a lot of these products either need to be kept at ambient temperature or room temperature, or they need to be kept in a refrigerated environment. Can we ensure that through the shipping process, if it was coming from New Zealand, can we ensure that it was kept appropriately at that temperature? The other question I would have too is what happens when there's supply chain issues? We ran into that obviously coming through the COVID pandemic where we had supply issues. And if a patient is dependent upon a medication and it's delayed for some reason, what's the protocol or process in place to get that medication to them if it's delayed for whatever reason? And this all comes down to, I think, tolerance for risk. And this is not a silver bullet, right? This is a tool that some people have utilized and decided to pursue. And in some cases, they leave it up to individual members on the plan to make that decision. But giving them guidance for quality assurance, safety, and informing people of the risk, I think is a part of that. We don't want anyone to be blindsided by the whole international sourcing complexity.
No, I would agree with that. I think just like anything, when there's high costs, there's always going to be opportunities for innovation and different ways to do things. And just as specialty has ballooned, that's become a higher target, higher savings and opportunities. But you also have to look at in pharmacy, right? What is savings? It's not, we focus a lot on savings in a health plan instead of what you're spending. And so that's, I guess I've got a pet peeve typically when we've got vendors that are just trying to grab all the brand and all the specialty. In an optimized pharmacy plan, there's only a handful of meds that are actually less expensive on a net basis going internationally. So it's really important not to have this like blanket, all of this goes through international, any brand or specialty over this cost threshold, because if you're in an optimized program, you have to consider the rebate. You have to consider different manufacturer copay cards, things like that may already be in play. That's something that you could end up putting a patient through another process and getting it mailed and the plan paying the same or more, and just more people getting paid in between. And at that point, we haven't solved the problem. We've just, taken a big part of the overspend and funded some other businesses with it.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think, this would probably be advice for the brokers out there is if you're thinking about sourcing drugs internationally, like start asking about the rebate impact it has. And what's the rebate on that Skyrizi drug? Does it make sense, to Trevor's point, on a net cost basis to actually move that over? You'd be surprised. Like there's vendors out there that are sourcing drugs internationally, and it's costing the plan more money because maybe it's a brand that could be a generic, or maybe on a net cost basis, it's actually costing the plan more.
And don't forego your prior authorization criteria and clinical criteria just to source, you're using Skyrizi as a great example. Well, maybe Skyrizi is not the optimal therapy, even if you get it for $7,500 internationally. Well, maybe there's something else that's better for $1,000 or $1,500, but you completely wiped out your PA criteria to just send everything internationally. And those are just some of the, I think, not necessarily bad actors, but those are some of the pitfalls. And we find that pharmacy pricing varies substantially by pharmacy in the US. It also varies substantially depending on the international pharmacies you're using and the programs that are coordinating them. There's some that Skyrizi would be $15,000. So it's double. And then when you get into that, then it's like, okay, now maybe we aren't saving money. So.
And clinical appropriateness has to be part of that picture. And just a little bit on prior authorizations. I know prior authorizations can be viewed negatively within the market. And I understand why. There are inherent challenges with prior authorizations, but at the same time, there's many cases where prior authorizations have actually protected the safety of the individual and protected the plan's cost because of prescribing patterns that may have been maybe influenced by pharmaceutical companies and not in the best interest of the patients or the plans.
Like the opioid epidemic?
So crazy you bring that up. So let's say you had a crystal ball and we're looking at international sourcing 10 years from now, because as you mentioned earlier, there's quite a bit of fight around the fact that it's not technically legal, but employers are doing it anyway. And you brought up the concept of ERISA being a fiduciary. I'm legally required to kind of look down, this barrel. What do we think about international sourcing's future? Is it something that's going away? Is it something that's going to get bigger? Is it something the government's going to squash? What do we think? What are our predictions here?
I'll take a stab. In the next 5 years, at least, I see international sourcing continuing to grow, partially based on the incoming administration that's kind of a proponent of these types of things. I think also with pharmaceutical manufacturers cracking down on patient assistance programs that have been used as a lever for savings. We're kind of in this cat and mouse game of, pharmaceutical manufacturers and PBMs are doing one thing and we're trying to figure out how to contain costs. And a lot of these solutions are gray. And so it's our job to really understand them and educate on the appetite for risk and the pros and cons. But I see it growing, especially as manufacturers start applying more pressure in removing patient assistance and copay assistance on brand and specialty meds. I think it's a one tool in your toolbox that you can use to fight back a little bit. And so I don't see it going away. I do think there is legitimacy to, especially our neighbors to the north saying, we get these medicines for our people, and that can create a supply chain issue.
Well, and that's a great point, because there is concern is if the U.S. started to expand international purchasing, what does that do to supply for people in other countries? Mm-hmm. And what would that bring? And I do agree that expansion is likely. We also have to look at the fact that we are becoming more of a global economy, just in general, across all areas of industry. And so it would make sense that the natural progression is to move healthcare to more of a global economy as well. I know there's a lot of, that's we're talking 10 years out, but with the, I want to say, the escalation and evolution of technology, and we're making this world smaller per se, that I think is going to be a natural progression for healthcare.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely.
I think it's, and then I'll kick it over to Mike, but I think it's just unsustainable what we're doing today, right? Like the balloon is being inflated so big, patients can't afford it, plans can't afford it, so something has to give. And I think this is an area where, you can find those wins, especially you think about some of the small businesses, 50 employees. They might be able to afford it for 1 year, but then they're not going to get renewed this second year.
Yeah, if they're on that drug forever, it's like,
yeah.
And what do you do?
Right.
We have to realize that, and I know there's numbers, I don't have them off the top of my head, but we subsidize the entire world from a pharmaceutical
I was going to ask about that
standpoint.
next, actually. Yeah.
Like we overpay so much for medications in the United States that it allows other countries to get them for less. And that's oversimplifying it.
Right.
But we're the golden goose.
Yeah.
And so that's where it's going to remain challenging. If you look at what pharma continues to attack, it's patient assistance programs, it's international sourcing, and it's 340B own use type pricing.
Yep.
So those are all the ways that we're trying to navigate through, but ultimately it's just flat out unsustainable. I mean, what's pharmacy costs are typically now about 30% of the total healthcare dollar.
Yeah, and then your specialty is 60% of that, right?
50 to 60% of that. So at some point, it just becomes an affordability issue.
Yeah.
And as a business owner myself and continuing to look at benefits, it's like, yeah, if I've got to take a 10% increase and a 20% increase on that, that impacts individuals I can hire. That impacts, pay raises, all those things. And I think that's why we've seen it be such a challenge for even large companies that we saw come together and try and fight the big bad industrial complex. And they didn't do it. Like it's a challenge.
Yeah, I would agree with both of you on what you're saying. I think we're going to see a ramp up in international sourcing. I still think it's a relatively untapped resource. I think the legality of it will have more of an impact on the long term. To Mark's point, what's going to end up happening. I mean, I think employers get hung up on the technical legality of it, right? There's a very, very gray area. But if that becomes no longer gray, it becomes black and white, then I do think you're going to start to see more and more employers start to do this. And that is naturally going to have an impact on the supply. And then things are going to change. I mean, the other thing I think will impact it is, just besides the legality of it, all these lawsuits out there right now against PBMs and plan sponsors, like some of the results of those may impact international sourcing at some point.
Yeah, and if you're not familiar, Google Johnson & Johnson to speak to the point of the lawsuits and fiduciary responsibility. They're in the middle of one right now. What do you think, Mark?
No, I think that this is going to be very interesting. I want to level set something though, because we can end up talking about all the negative components of PBMs and the pharma industry, but I also want to balance this back out and say, the pharmaceutical companies have brought tremendous value to the healthcare system by bringing essentially treatments that are quite amazing. I mean, we've been able to treat things now that we've never been able to treat before. So I don't want to necessarily devalue what they bring to the table. At the same time, just some accountability on pricing is a big factor. Same way with the PBMs. The PBMs have come to basically help mitigate and manage a lot of cost. It comes back to balance, making sure that they aren't given too much power, if you will, and just kind of balancing that out. So I don't want to become kind of an anti-pharmacy, anti-PBM messaging here. I think we're just seeking to make everything equitable, accountable, transparent as best as possible. But we want companies to flourish as well. And we want to do it the right and the best way possible. But the thing is, the other comment I was going to make related to
our projection.
Projection is the fact that the pharmaceutical companies have recognized that specialty pharmacy is a very profitable venture. They know that. And that's where you see the majority of the research is in specialty drugs. But I will tell you, as a pharmacist, this is one of my frustrations. For the entire existence of my career, we always categorized drugs based upon therapeutic indication or the way they worked. A beta blocker, we used ACE inhibitors, we used HMG-CoA reductase inhibitors. But at the end of the day, we have now, for the last 20 years, started to move drugs into a category that we just call special. Hey, this is a special drug. This is a special drug. And we've called it special based upon cost, not based upon therapeutic indication, not based upon how it works. We just say, well, because it's so expensive, we're going to treat it special. And there's not an industry standard. And so you could go to 10 different PBMs and have 10 different specialty lists because we haven't standardized what that actually means. And it seems like what's happening here is we continue to see more and more drugs being categorized as specialty. And what that does is it essentially the PBMs, as they require their plans to utilize their specialty-owned pharmacies, that pipeline continues to grow and more drugs will go into the specialty category. And I would say, as we talk about the future, we may see more international sourcing as that grows and expands. But I do think somewhere along the line, we have to have some degree of accountability on how we define a specialty drug and how that's to be managed and how that's to be taken.
Yeah, why can't it just be the same definition across the board?
Right.
Why can't it work like math? It's just this is the way it is.
Yep.
So speaking of specialty drugs, I want to pivot for a second because I don't want to leave this topic untouched. GLP-1s. We were in the car on the way over here, the four of us discussing, what we wanted to chat about today. And presently there are less than 10 GLP-1 drugs in the market, right? I'm not misspeaking there. Less than 10?
Approximately.
Approximately.
Yeah.
And I think it was you, Mark, brought up there are about to be how many that flood the market?
So, yeah, there's several in the pipeline. The last I looked, there was about 60 GLP-1s that were somewhere in the pipeline.
60.
Yes.
So as we talk about the future, I mean, obviously as broker advisors, GLP-1s have been a hot topic for the last 4 or 5 years because of their gaining popularity. So now we have to continue to look at how that's going to be different when now we don't just have, our subset of less than 10 options. We have 50 to 60 options in the market. What does that look like as far as managing the risk for an employer? Obviously that's going to be quite the burden to bear, I think, for the broker community as we move forward.
So yeah, GLP-1 drugs, and that could be a whole separate,
whole different episode.
podcast, right? In and of itself.
Are we doing a third one?
Yeah, GLP-1s.
Right. Push your flights back, everybody.
You know, just real quick history. 20 years ago, we had the first GLP-1 come to market, and essentially it was used for diabetes. And as pharmacists, we were educating patients that a side effect you might get from these drugs is you might lose some weight. Well, fast forward, and now that side effect has become a reason for why people want these drugs. And the price tag on these have escalated significantly as well. And that's why they're drawing so much attention. And GLP-1s have just pharmacologically a lot of effects within our body. So the manufacturers are going after indications for GLP-1 drugs beyond just diabetes and weight loss, but also sleep apnea and dementia and a whole host of other types of diseases.
Cardiac indication.
Cardiac indication. And that will proliferate as well as the GLP-1s continue to proliferate in terms of how they're used and when they're used. And if the price tag remains high, that's going to be another challenge to the employers. How does a self-funded employer deal with the rising costs? How do they manage that? And there are several strategies beyond the scope of our podcast that you can put some guardrails in your plan to help manage that a little bit. But it's still a huge question that we have to ask is how do we manage that for the future?
Yeah, I think GLP-1, at least in our world, we hear about it or talk about it daily. And again, and there's no silver bullet, right? There's a lot of different considerations. You've got to look at it from a plan perspective, a patient perspective, a pharmacist perspective, a clinician perspective. All of those things need to be considered when putting together a GLP-1 strategy. What I think's interesting for it is in a typical market, more options would create competition and drive price down, right? But our pharmaceutical market is not really typical. So I wouldn't expect all of those new GLP-1s to really drive prices down because historically they are priced in what the market can bear and no real, logical reasoning as to why it's priced that way. So it would be ideal, some people might think, oh my gosh, we got 60 GLP-1s, that's going to create competition. Not really likely.
Yeah.
And the funny thing is, even though, these injectable GLP-1s act very similar to a specialty medication when it comes to how they're administered, they're not typically considered specialty in most plans. So again, that goes back to this, well, what is specialty? What isn't?
Right.
The only reason to have a vague definition is so that you can play games or drive, to your point, drive volume to one of your own pharmacies. So I do think it's something we're going to continue to battle. I think you're going to see a lot of innovation come from it because entities have to find solutions for it, right? Like we can't there's so many people in America that can benefit from them and have been shown to benefit, and that it's very different from, Hep C a decade ago where it's like, oh my gosh, it's $80,000 for a course of treatment. How are we going to afford that? Well, the majority of the population doesn't have Hep C.
Right.
But I don't know what the numbers are from the ADA now, but a high percentage of our U.S. population has prediabetes or diabetes. Yeah. So that's the problem. Is it's kind of death by $1,000 cuts,
right,
opposed to one big hitter.
Yep.
Yeah, I mean, is anybody else concerned about the overprescription of this stuff? Right. I mean, I think my main issue with GLP-1s is we're not addressing the root cause of the issue here.
Right.
We're already the most overprescribed country in the world, right? What's the stats? We have 25%, I think, of the total prescriptions in the world are coming from the United States. So, and when you think about our obesity rates and then the childhood obesity rates, I just worry that this strategy is about to just get completely out of control. And before you know it, we're going to have half the U.S. population taking this stuff. Mm-hmm. And that's probably my bigger concern. That's a bigger issue on how to address the root cause. But I have plenty of employers that are just we're going to exclude weight loss coverage. We're not going to cover medications there because they're afraid of what the cost of this stuff is going to be. I mean, you think about having half your population on a drug that costs $1,000 a month. Right. That's scary.
I think it's important to level set a little bit too, because we tend to bunch GLP-1s into one category when We've got true valid uses for diabetes. We've now got indications, same drug, just different name, for weight loss. And to Mark's point, we're going to have even more indications come up. So it's how do you balance that, right? I think weight loss is easier to tackle because most plans that we see don't cover weight loss medications today, but it's becoming a recruiting and retention tool. And so employers really have to look long and hard about what is the investment, what's our average turnover, are we going to help people get better? Because it's a little bit different than the wellness programs and the well-being programs where it's like there may not be a hard ROI, but we know this is best for our people. But now we've got this magic pill or injection.
Well, and the other thing I want to all of your points, just because you lose weight does not equate to being healthy. And here's the big concern. I mean, is our goal just to lose weight? Because, and I've used this example before, if you have a horrible junk food diet, and now you're on a GLP-1 and all you've done is reduce the caloric intake of your junk food diet, are you now a healthy person? You're a thinner, unhealthy person. Mm-hmm. And what we've done is lose sight of the fact is what really is our goal here? Is it improved health or is it to be thinner?
Ego.
Right.
Yeah.
And I don't want to minimize the real challenge of obesity because and there's by the way, there's class 1, 2, and 3 obesity, and the type of obesity that a person has does weigh into the clinical decision making there. So I think that's an important piece. But we've kind of went down the path of establishing these drugs as a silver bullet, when in fact they're not. They have real side effects. They have real challenges. A good percentage, 40, 50% of people will stop taking them in 6 months. So you have employers paying for them, not seeing the overall value. And then it does speak to the big question is drugs do impact your medical benefit. So if you improve health, sometimes a higher cost drug is beneficial because it brings down the overall cost. And I think it's important to recognize you can't just silo pharmacy out and not look at the impact of it on the medical side.
Yep.
I'll say this, if you have diabetics that are taking their drugs 50% of the time and you put in a program and now they take it 100% of the time, guess what? Your drug costs all just went up.
Right.
But that's a good reason for your drug costs to go up because you're taking the medications the way they intended to be. Drug costs increasing in the right way should reduce your medical costs. And you do have to correlate those two together. So I just bring that up as because it does impact the GLP-1 discussion. If you better control diabetes, if you better control weight, it does have medical cost implications beyond just the cost of the drug.
Yep.
So I remember my point now, which is the rebate game they're playing and what we're seeing. I think that's the part that scares me. It's like there's all these forces that are kind of pushing these types of drugs out to market, and the latest one we're seeing is it's like, oh, you're not gonna cover that. Well, we're gonna take away all your rebates then. We're not gonna give you any rebates on any drugs if you're not gonna cover these drugs. Our
entire formulary.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, interesting. So I want us to round third here with our last little topic of conversation, kind of put a bow on this. Something that obviously at Claim Doc that we concern ourselves with quite a bit is cost, right? Cost of care, and how do we control and protect the plan assets. And you brought up an interesting point this morning. We were in the hotel. We were talking about worrying about the right drugs, the costs of the right drugs. Do you want to extrapolate on that a little bit for us? We can discuss.
So in the market, we have over 20,000 different molecules. We have over 60,000 different drug products, and it's actually overwhelming when you think about what we have currently to deal with. And the real challenge is we spend a lot of time trying to get the best prices, but maybe on all the wrong drugs. In other words, if we're getting the best price, and we'll stick with GLP-1s for a second. What if you got the best price for GLP-1s, but in fact, there's a more cost-effective option to utilize? Maybe we should spend less time about trying to get the best price on that particular drug and facilitate and foster better, more cost-effective prescribing or more cost-effective prescribing patterns. And does the PBM facilitate or foster more clinically effective, more cost-effective drug therapy, or is it really focused on the drugs that are most profitable or have the biggest rebates? I mean, that comes back to that full circle to the fiduciary responsibilities. Yep. But the reality is we have a lot of drug treatments that we can get very inexpensively,
Right.
but we're not really looking at them. And it comes back to the point I was saying before. Just because it's new and expensive doesn't mean it's better than the drugs we've had on the market before. And it does depend on the disease category, what we're treating, clinical factors, but that's what we need to step back and say, what's the most cost-effective way to manage a disease?
Well, I think other countries do this, right? Isn't it called comparative effectiveness research? Which I think is part of what you were going down the path of. And you brought it up with FDA approvals earlier, which is it's compared to a placebo. It's not compared to anything else in the class that could be better or worse, where other countries are actually looking at it saying, is it clinically better and worth the price tag? And that would be something that, we're seeing some PBMs get into that market as far as leaning that direction and helping make better healthcare decisions. Because like you said, maybe the GLP-1's not, even if we get the best price on it. Well, the best price on the drug that should have never been prescribed,
Right.
what's the point?
That's what I'd like to see more out of more PBMs is that piece right there. Everybody is focused on cost because it is just like out there in front of your face. You see the numbers, but like we get people to the cost-effective drugs to the right drug. That's what we need to do. That's what we need our PBM partners to help us do.
And I also think, as a pharmacy owner, you'll probably appreciate this. Let's make it profitable for a pharmacy to dispense the more cost-effective drugs, right? I mean, and let's make it profitable for pharma to create them. Still, I think we're going to see, if you talk about the next 5 to 10 years, is like they're not creating any more generics for us that are going to be pennies a pill. It's not profitable for the pharmacies. It's not profitable for pharma. So we might just end up with all these high-cost drugs, which would be a real shame. But I think that's a reality.
Well, and to one other comment I'd like to tag on to, and that's that when we talked about prior authorizations, we talked about matching up the utilization of the drug to the FDA indications. But the FDA is not a clinical guideline committee. It's outside their purview. They're just evaluating safety and efficacy compared to placebo, but they're not a guideline committee to help clinicians make decisions. But the PBMs have taken the FDA indications and turned them into clinical guidelines. And so it's actually not even appropriate to evaluate drug therapy based simply on an FDA indication. What does the American Diabetes Association say? What's the American Endocrinology Association say? Not just what the FDA say. So I think that's another conflict within the industry that's going to continue to foster increasingly high cost drugs.
Yeah. Well, Mark, Trevor, Mike, thank you so much for bringing your brains here to Des Moines and downloading with us. I hope any listener that listened today learned something new. I certainly did. I learned a lot of new things. So thank you very much for putting some more arrows in my quiver. Don't forget to like or subscribe to Claim Talk wherever you're listening to this podcast. We appreciate your being here. Thanks again, guys.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, appreciate it.